to a very famous self-development YouTuber. Him and Matthew Vela kind of run that world, and he's going to talk about how to study for exams. It's one of his most popular videos ever, and I'm going to kind of react to the video, add my own thoughts and tips, and kind of go from there. So, without further ado, let me just make sure my video camera doesn't go missing when I play it. Without further ado, let's go. By the way, I like to play things at 2 times speed. I'm used to the quality and speed. If you want to slow it down, you can, but hope you don't mind.
Going to be sharing with you evidence-based revision tips. So I'm going to be giving you advice on how you can prepare for your exams, but hopefully I'll be backing up everything I say with evidence from studies that have been done in the field of psychology on students like you and me over the last 100 years. No one ever really teaches us how to study. We tend to just go with what feels intuitively right. And as we'll see, the research has shown that actually the techniques that students think are the most intuitive often tend not to be the ones that are actually the most effective. So if you've got exams coming up, then hopefully by the end of this video, you'll pick up some techniques that you can apply to your own studies to make everything a little bit more efficient and enjoyable. So let's just jump into it. This is going to be the structure of the video. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the 3 very popular revision techniques that are shown to be less effective in the literature, namely rereading, highlighting, and making notes/summarizing. Those are by far the most popular techniques, but they're also not very effective if you look at the evidence behind them. Secondly, I'm going to be introducing the concept of active recall, which is by far the most powerful, effective study technique. And that involves like testing yourself and practicing retrieving information from your brain, because the very act of retrieving information actually strengthens connections in the brain, and there's like a load of evidence behind this. And finally, in part 3 of the video, I'll be giving you some specific tips on how you can actually apply this active recall thing to your own study. So hopefully by the end of the video, you'll have some practical strategies that you can apply if you feel like it. As always, everything is going to be timestamped down below.
Yeah, so it seems like the big one is active recall, which I've definitely covered before, but I love to hear his thoughts here, and I definitely get the sense that this is a guy, and you're probably one of those people too, who actually actively looks for what works, what doesn't, and why, because I think there's a lot of people who do well in school, but they never really consciously think about it or really audit themselves and figure out what's working, what's not, why is it working, what could work better, and they just go off intuition, and it's done well for them so far, so why change anything? And I think while that works, I think you have more potential to do better by watching videos like this.
So if you want to skip to a certain bit of the video, feel free. But now let's jump into it and let's talk about the 3 common but not very effective revision techniques that students love to use. Let's start with rereading. Over here is going to be a list of some of the various studies that have been done that show that students really love rereading as like a really common revision technique. And if you look at what you've done for your own exams and ask your friends, you probably find out that rereading plays a big part of most people's exam preparation strategy. The question is rereading effective as a study technique? There have been lots of studies on about this. I will link some of them in the description below, but I'm not going to go into each of them in depth. Instead, I'm going to be quoting from a paper written by Professor Donlowski, which was written in 2013, where he and his colleagues analyzed like hundreds of papers looking at all the research behind 10 different revision techniques. And this is what he had to say on the topic of rereading. He said, based on the available evidence, we rate rereading as having low utility. Although rereading is relatively economical with respect to time demands, when compared with other learning techniques, rereading is also typically much less effective. The relative disadvantage of rereading to other techniques is the largest strike against it, and it's a factor that weighted most heavily in our decision to assign it a rating of low utility. So this professor, who's a psychology professor, and he and his colleagues have looked at hundreds of research papers looking at evidence-based revision techniques, regards rereading your notes or rereading your textbooks as having low utility. He's saying that yeah, there's some limited evidence that rereading does work, it does improve retention somewhat, but especially if you compare it to other techniques that you could be doing, rereading is pretty much a waste of time. Here's another quote from a 2016 paper that again looked at the evidence behind lots of study techniques, and this is what they had to say about rereading. They said, a wealth of research has shown that passive, repetitive reading produces little or no.
Yeah, so I think one thing that you can do that can really help with just checking certain techniques is go to Google Scholar and then search that up. And if you like, as you get better at it, you'll find studies that kind of have been done uh, on certain techniques, note taking, Pomodoro, whatever, and you can kind of get a sense for if that method works or doesn't through rigorous tests that oftentimes, if you had to do yourself, will require tons of coordination, teamwork, and money. So we're very blessed in this digital age to have that, and I love that how he's bringing in some of this research to prove that rereading is just not that effective.
No benefit for learning, yet not only was repetitive reading the most frequently listed strategy, it was also the strategy most often listed as students' #1 choice by a large margin. So that's what I'm going to say about rereading for the time being. I'm very happy to discuss all the evidence against rereading and against these other techniques. If you guys want to hear about that, just leave a comment down below and I'll do it. But I want to focus on stuff you can do rather than kind of just hopping on the stuff that you shouldn't be doing. So we'll close that for now. Rereading, generally, according to the evidence, is pretty ineffective. It does sort of work, but compared to other things you could be doing, it's by no means the most efficient study tactic. Secondly, let's talk about highlighting. And either we highlight ourselves or we know friends who like to highlight their textbooks and the notes in pretty colors. Here is a list of studies that show that highlighting is a very popular revision strategy, and I'll link these studies in the description below, so if you really want to read them, you can. But let's go back to Professor Donlowski's paper, where again he looked at all the evidence around these, and this is what he had to say about highlighting and underlining. He said, on the basis of available evidence, we rate highlighting and underlining as having low utility. In most situations that have been examined and with most participants, highlighting does little to boost performance. It may help when students have the knowledge needed to highlight more effectively, or when the texts are difficult, but it may actually hurt performance on higher level tasks that require inference making. Especially with art subjects at GCSE and most subjects at A level, and definitely everything at undergrad, all of these subjects require inference making. So highlighting, Professor Donlowski is saying, is probably not a very good tactic. He continues.
Yeah, so highlighting and underlining are probably still going to be very common. I remember in like middle school or elementary school, there was a girl who, and she wasn't alone. I think there was a few other classmates. She highlighted like every other line, and then a lot of people would underline stuff in books. Um, Especially if you're not going back to what you highlight or underline, but you're only doing the first pass through. It's like, what's the point? Like, you're putting that there to highlight it so that when you go back, you can zone in on it. So that's a discrepancy that I would love to get more detail on. Like, are you talking highlighting or highlighting and then going back? But either way, I think um, it's interesting what he's bringing here as a thought process.
He says future research should be aimed at teaching students how to highlight effectively, given that students are likely to continue to use this popular technique despite its relative ineffectiveness. So he's conceding in his paper that although the evidence shows that highlighting is not very good, to be honest, students are probably going to continue using it. And later on in the paper, he described highlighting as a safety blanket that's
And do you know why I think people are going to continue doing it? I don't know why the scientists think so, but I think it's because the world is just so vast. It's so large. Even with this video with 3 million people, that's a drop in the bucket to the 7 billion in the world. And millions more keep being born every year. Um, I found this out years ago through just watching fitness videos and other videos that just got millions of views. And I thought, it's reaching such a large audience. And I'm like, now the world has to know that this doesn't work and this doesn't work, and you need this type of technique to do a hip thrust or a bicep curl, or you gotta eat this type of food and you don't. And then I go to the gym and I keep seeing the same, all these people making the same obvious mistakes. And I'm like, there's all this information on YouTube. I watch all these videos, I know it. And then I came to the conclusion, like, you know, the world's just so vast. There's going to be tons of people still making very elementary mistakes, despite the knowledge online.
students like to have. I've experienced this, I'm sure you've experienced this as well. It feels productive, doesn't it? Like, going through a book and highlighting one thing in blue and one thing in yellow, one thing in orange. I have been using pretty much all my life and still use to this day, but I'm trying to phase it out because the evidence around summarizing and making notes is, a bit equivocal. There are some studies that show that students that do summarizing well perform slightly better on exams, but it's really quite hard to test this because, as you can imagine, the quality of notes varies massively between students, and so that makes it quite hard to actually test a proper rigorous scientific study about it. In any case, Professor Dunlosky, again, he and his colleagues tried. They looked at all the evidence around summarizing and making notes, and this is what they said. On the basis of the available evidence, we rate summarization as low utility. It can be an effective learning strategy for learners who are already skilled at summarizing. However, many learners, including children, high school students, and even some undergraduates, will require extensive training, which makes this strategy less feasible. What they're saying is,
so he's basically pulling all this research saying that highlighting doesn't work, that rereading something doesn't work, and that summarizing something doesn't work. So then what's left? I'm curious where he's going to lead to. Is he going to say uh, some type of combination of this where you summarize all this stuff and then try and recall it through memory? Um, I'm curious where he's going to go. I think uh, all those things, highlighting, underlining, rereading, stuff like that, they kind of touch on active recall if done right. They could also be done wrong. If you're just highlighting, that's not true active recall. So, curious where he's going to go with this, uh, and if it comes back to summarizing, even though he's saying right now it doesn't work.
is that if you already know how to effectively summarize and make notes, which you might well do, although it tends not to be taught in schools or anything, if you already know that, then okay, summarization is probably going to help you. But even if that's the case, even if you're already quite pro at summarizing, it still falls about the middle of the pack when compared to other more effective revision techniques. But I think in general, the conclusion we should draw from this is that we are sort of wasting our time probably by making notes. Now, that's not to say that if you enjoy making notes that you shouldn't do it. I enjoy making notes. I like having pretty colors. I like, trying to do a bit of, calligraphy on them. Taking photos for the Instagram. My friends comment on like, oh, your notes are so pretty. But to be honest, I wouldn't want to make notes thinking it's an effective revision strategy. And I know looking back on the school days, a lot of my friends who were really into their notes, that have these massive blue folders for chemistry and have absolutely beautiful notes. Those were the students that would spend hours and hours on a single topic and then kind of complain sometimes about why stuff wasn't going in. So yeah, making notes, summarizing sort of works, probably doesn't. Evidence is a bit iffy about it. I think we should be avoiding it personally based on the results of these review papers.
So, first off, part one was a huge revelation, I think, to a lot of people. I mean, I would say most people I see in classes take notes and they think it works. They believe it works because then you can recall your notes, repeat your notes, keep repeating it. So I'm really curious, like, if he's going to go back on what he just said now, because active recall at some level is recalling what you've already learned. So how are you going to do that if you're not going to summarize it?
Alright, just to sum up what we talked about so far, we've said that rereading, highlighting, underlining, and summarizing are probably not very effective revision strategies based on the evidence. So yeah, if we want to make our revision more efficient, we probably shouldn't be doing these three things that we all like to do. We had a lecture about this in our second year of medicine, and it was towards the end of the year when we had exams coming up, and my mind was completely blown when I found out that highlighting and making notes was not very efficient. And talking to a lot of my friends, we were all absolutely aghast that, like, how could we have survived these 22 years of our life without knowing, effective study techniques, and that we felt that a lot of our own success in exams had been in spite of our revision techniques rather than because of them. So, hopefully at this point you're thinking that, okay, maybe we should be spending a little bit less time doing rereading, highlighting, and making notes. Let's now talk about active recall. And active recall is by far the most important technique that you can.
Well, first off, this is just a fun fact. I think he has really respectful, intelligent friends. Because when I bring up like studies and stuff, maybe it's how I deliver it, or just that people don't care. They're just like, oh, okay, cool. Or they'll debate it, or they'll be skeptical about these studies, or they'll go in one ear, one out the other, and they'll continue doing the same thing. It's strange how human nature works.
And should be using in order to make your studies more efficient. Active recall or active retrieval or practice testing, whatever you want to call it, basically involves retrieving facts from your brain, retrieving stuff from your brain, because the very act of retrieving stuff from your brain actually strengthens the connections between the stuff in your brain. And this was quite counterintuitive to me. Like, for me anyway, I always kind of assumed learning was this sort of process whereby you put stuff into your brain, and the only purpose of getting stuff out of your brain was to, ace that exam or get that A star or whatever. In fact, this cannot be further from the truth, and over 100 years of research has shown that we learn far better by practicing retrieving stuff from our brains than by trying to, put stuff back into our brains. So what's the evidence behind this? Let's go back to Professor Dunlosky's review paper, the one where he looked at 100 studies and, decided that rereading, highlighting, and summarizing weren't very good. This is what these guys had to say about practice recall, active recall, practice testing. They said, on the basis of the evidence described above, we rate practice testing as having high utility. Practice testing is not particularly time-intensive relative to other techniques, and it can be implemented with minimal training. Finally, several studies have provided evidence for the efficacy of practice testing in representative educational contexts. So, this review paper that's looked at loads of studies, again, they've said practice testing has very high utility, and in fact, if you read the paper and their conclusions, they recommend.
Sounds like he's coming to his final conclusion, which is probably like flashcards, which is a very common thing that people do, or some type of practice test. So interesting. We'll see where it takes him first.
Recommend that everyone, start testing themselves more if they're not doing it enough already. And because this is really, really important, I'm going to be sharing with you 3 different studies that actually show this properly. If you're already convinced by active recall at this point, you can skip to this timestamp, and then at this timestamp we'll just be talking about the specific strategies that you can use to implement active recall in your studies. But if you're interested in the evidence, then continue watching this video, and I'll explain some of the studies that have been done that convincingly show that active recall is by far a better revision strategy than pretty much anything else you can do. So let's start with this study from 1939, the start of World War II. This sort of research has been going back literally decades and decades. What they did is that they got groups of students and they made them learn a topic and then gave them a test either a week later or a day later. Now, half of these students just kind of studied the material as they normally would, and these are their results. So you can see the results are around about 50% for the high achievers and around sort of 30% for the bottom third of the group, as decided by some other outcome measure. So that was half of the group. They just studied the subject as they normally would have done, and they got a test either a day later or a week later. Now, the other half of the class studied the content in exactly the same way. However, they had a practice test at the end of it, and these are their results. So as you can see, the guys that had the practice test did far better. It's an increase of like 15% for the high achievers, an increase of like 10 to 15% for the bottom third of the class. Just having a practice test at the end of their study session improved their performance by 10 to 15%. And I don't know about you, but if I could improve my exam performance from by 10 to 15% just by practice testing myself a bit at the end of each study session, I would certainly take that. But that's just one study. Let's talk about another study, a more recent one. This one's from 2010, and again, they split students up into 2 groups. One group were going to have a practice test, and the other group were just going to restudy the material using whatever method they wanted, most likely rereading, highlighting, and summarizing, which, as we've seen from other studies, are the most popular revision techniques for students. And this study was interesting because it tested students on both the facts and concepts. Here is the group that just restudied the material.
I think the one distinction that I would have loved more elaboration on is, um, do they review the answers and the ones they got wrong with the practice test, and then learned why they got them wrong, or did they just blind take the practice test, got their score, and moved on? Because that's a huge distinction, and I think the former would be much more effective.
Normally, and these are their results. So, hovering between kind of 30 and 40% because they just studied the material once and then, had a test a week later. And here is the group that studied the material, had a little practice test at the end of it, and then had the same test a week later. And these are their results. And as you can see, they're performing significantly better. For some, it's even an increase of like 30% for the first group, a difference between 30% and 60%. And again, I don't know about you, but if I could get a 30% improvement in my exam score by practicing testing myself, I would certainly take it, and I would, be doubling down on that strategy as much as I possibly could. Finally, this is one of my favorite studies. This is done from 2011, and what they did was they split students into 4 different groups. They had to learn the material and then had a test at the end, like a week later or something like that. The first group was just supposed to study the text, the chapter once. The second group was just supposed to study it 4 times. The third group read the text once and then made a mind map. And the fourth group read the text once and then just tried to recall as much of the contents of the text as they possibly could. So we've got these 4 groups. Here are the results. So on verbatim questions, questions specifically from the text about factual things mentioned in the text, the group that studied it once performed the worst. As you can see, the active recall group performed significantly better than the group that restudied it 4 times. This kind of tells me that, if I just practice testing myself once, that's probably more effective than rereading the chapter 4 times. And rereading a chapter 4 times is such a common strategy that, it's pretty insane that you can get better results by just testing yourself once, by just reading it once and just trying to recall as much of it as you can. Okay, so that was verbatim questions. Let's take these same groups of people and ask them inference questions. So questions that require you to kind of understand the text a bit more, not just retrieve isolated facts from it. And here are their results. As you can see, the group that studied it once performed the worst, as you'd expect, because they only studied it once. The active recall group performed the best, and
all right, we get the gist now. I think he's saying how powerful active recall is. I think the big gist here is that there's a bunch of study techniques that are very common, and some of them are good. Most of them aren't that effective, but they're all mixed in there. Everyone does most of them, and you got to stop highlighting, underlining, and summarizing and taking notes. Uh, or at least if you do them, know that they're not as effective, and then just keep doing practice tests and doing that active recall. And I'm sure I already see it in here, flashcards. So let's just jump down to uh, his points
Next
about
video. Point. Hopefully I've convinced you that rereading, highlighting, and summarizing / making notes are not very effective revision strategies, as judged by the evidence. Again, links in the description below if you want to read it for yourself. And hopefully I've convinced you that active recall or practice testing is a really, really useful technique, and it's far more efficient than these other techniques that students enjoy using. Now we're going to be talking about specific strategies that you can use to apply active recall or practice.
So I'm going to give my review so far because very few people are going to wait until the end of my video to do my review. I think Ali has some great points here. He definitely did his research on the science. I really respect that. And yeah, I think the video could be a lot more succinct, but I get it. I like to talk as well. Um, I think um, this is very interesting stuff, and I think that should have been just like the first thing right out of the gate. Like, did you know that most of the techniques that are super common that people use to study are very ineffective? That would have been like the how you should have brought them in, just coming from a YouTuber standpoint. But yeah, I think it's interesting for sure, and I'd love to see what he says next.
Practice testing in your own studies. And the first thing to say is that this is not really rocket science. Pretty much anything you do that requires you to use cognitive effort, like use brain power to retrieve information that you have learned once already, pretty much anything is going to be really, really efficient for you. But having said that, I know a lot of you guys benefit from specific strategies. So here are 3 that I find useful personally. Number 1 is an app called Anki. And Anki is a flashcard app that you might have heard of, like loads of medical students use it. The idea behind that is that you make like an online flashcard and then it comes up and in your like practice session. But the special thing about Anki is that once a flashcard comes up, you can mark it as being easy, medium, or hard. And depending on what rating you gave it, it comes up later on depending on what the rating was. So if you found a fact really easy to recall, maybe they'll ask you again in a day. If you found it hard to recall, they'll ask you again in 10 minutes. If you found it impossible to recall, they'll ask you again in 1 minute. And this kind of learns from your behavior. It kind of changes over.
Yeah, so I think he's basically saying take less notes, do less highlighting, do less underlining, do less rereading of stuff, and do more flashcard themed stuff where you're actively being tested and given the answers. Now, most students do all these things in different levels. I know I've done them all. So, I think the one caveat I would add is that, like, some of that first stuff are building blocks to the flashcards because most of the time in classes you aren't given some template practice test or template set of flashcards. You have to make that yourself. And to do that, sometimes you need to use the building blocks of the notes that you took in class or after class to make the flashcards yourself. Because there is no, sometimes there is, but there is no, like if you're taking organic chemistry, yeah, there probably is something already. But depending on the class, there's no open source flashcard set up for you already. So I think this shift here is to know the end focus is that practice test and that testing that you need to do. Um,
Over time. So as you progress through your studies, as you progress through your revision, some facts that are really easy, you might see them in 2 months' time because the whole algorithm changes and it really uses this whole spaced repetition thing to great effect. I think Anki is really good for 2 things. Firstly, I think it's really good for memorizing particular facts. So I used it a lot for anatomy back in the day, whereas what's the nerve supply for particular muscles, things like that. And I used it a lot for pharmacology, so learning the names of drugs and what they do and what the mechanism of action is. In my third year when I was doing psychology as a subject, I also used Anki like a lot to memorize particular paragraphs to like slot into my essays. On one side of the flashcard, I would have copy key and blunt 2011, and on the other side of the flashcard, I would describe the study that they did and the evidence behind it and what I was going to say about it. So therefore, in the essay, in the exam, when I wanted to recall the copy key and blunt study, I would have kind of the information about it already memorized. So I used it to memorize chunks.
I think that's all great and fine. I would say the one issue that you may run into is that, uh, and I've run into this, the issue with this whole flashcard exercise is you don't know what they're going to test you on sometimes. There's some classes I had, like there's a mammalian physiology class, for example, where the teachers were just, I guess, kind of bad, maybe even terrible. And there's so many ways they could go with what they could test you on, and they kept it super vague and mysterious. It was a mess. So, like, they could have tested, like, you had tons and tons of chapters to read all the time, and so the issue is, like, what do you even, which questions you put on your flashcard? You just put all of them. That's way too much stuff. So, like, how do you actually drill it down into something manageable, and choose what you think the teacher might test you on? And that's another question that you have to kind of decide for yourself. Maybe you just randomly choose stuff that you think will likely be there. You ask the teacher, but there are some rare cases where it's just like, what do I even start with?
that I could then drag and drop into my essays effectively. One of my friends is a Cambridge medic. He's got like first class every year. He uses Anki for pretty much everything, and he said that he can't imagine getting through Cambridge without having used Anki. And instead of making notes and lectures, what he started doing now is just going directly to making the flashcard. So yeah, if you're interested, please do check out Anki. It's free. I think you can pay a few pounds for the iOS version, but even if you don't want to pay, you can use the web version.
Yeah, and I love this Anki thing because you have like different ratings that you can put on a flashcard, which is fantastic. So that the frequency that it shows up again is great. Um, but yeah, I mean, there are times where you just have floods, passages. I mean, history class is a great example. Whole passages of things they could pick out and test you on. Which ones, like, do you even choose? You can't put them all. It's just too much. So that's, I think, partially where um, you have to start to understand the rhythm of the system, as in what what's the flair, the style of the teacher, and what type of things does he usually or she usually choose.
Having used Anki. And instead of making notes and lectures, what he started doing now is just going directly to making flashcards. So yeah, if you're interested, please do check out Anki. It's free. I think you can pay a few pounds for the iOS version, but even if you don't want to pay, you can use the web version completely free of charge. I'll link it here and in the description below. Secondly, something that I like doing because I still can't quite break the habit that I enjoy making notes is that making notes with the book closed. So not like having the textbook open and making notes and making all pretty and copying from the textbook like I used to do, but actually like learning a topic and then closing the book and then thinking, okay, how would I explain this topic? How would I kind of make my own notes on it? So now I write down as much as I can remember about the topic in a nice fashion with like pretty colors.
Now that I like. So that's a distinction. See, I was not concerned, but I was like, how are you going to bring it? You're probably going to bring it back to note taking, but you said note taking is bad. I think the distinction here is not that note taking or highlighting or writing, rereading or underlining is bad in itself. But if you can apply it, I guess rereading would be the one exception, but if you can apply it in an active recall fashion, then it becomes very useful. So don't just be a transcriber of notes in front of you. If you can take those notes and then rewrite them again, maybe even in a more condensed, summarized way, now you're drawing from your brain actively. It's essentially continuously working your memory. That's what it is in one sentence.
Because that makes me feel good. And then afterwards, I open the book and see the bits that I missed. And actually, when I was preparing for my third year exams in third year psychology, I ended up that was by far my best performance like ever in my life on any exams. And I think the reason behind that was that because I very aggressively used these two techniques of spaced repetition and active recall. So what I did, I made about 50 different essay plans initially earlier on in the year, and then in order to commit those to memory, I just drew spider diagrams with the book closed. So I would have a spider diagram for each essay plan, and I just draw out as much of it as I could possibly remember. And then afterwards, when I was done with it, I'd look at my actual essay plan and fill out the bits that were missing. And I repeated this over the course of like 2 months leading up to the exams. And by the end of it, by the time the exam came around, I had these 50 really good essays in my head that had like 10 references each, and was able to just kind of vomit them onto the paper in the actual exam. So I would fully endorse this whole making notes, making spider diagrams with the book closed as being a really effective method of active recall. And there is actually some evidence behind this again. It's in the book Make It Stick. It's also in Professor Noss's paper. You can read down below. Finally, I want to talk about a third strategy, and that's an alternative to making notes. I know that this whole making notes thing, it's really hard to not make notes. So these days, if I'm in a lecture or if I want to learn something, instead of making notes from the lecture or from the textbook, what I instead do is that I write questions for myself. And I think this is called like the Cornell Note-Taking method. I came across that earlier today when researching stuff for this video. The idea is that you write questions for yourself based on the material, such that when you revise the material, you look at your questions and you try and actively answer them in your head or on paper or
Let me watch this part at a lower speed because I think this last technique is important.
called like the Cornell Note-Taking method. I came across that earlier today when researching stuff for this video. The idea is that you write questions for yourself based on the material, such that when you revise the material, you look at your questions and you try and actively answer them in your head or on paper or out loud or whatever. The point is that instead of passively rereading or highlighting the information like we are tempted to do, we have to engage in cognitive effort to retrieve this information from our brains, and that strengthens the connections between the information. It makes us more likely to remember it and to understand it. So I actually gave a talk about this evidence-based revision thing like 3 years ago when I was a third year, and a friend of mine who was a first year medic at the time, after this talk, he had about 2 months left until the exams, and he decided that the only technique he was going to use was to just write questions for himself. So for the entire Cambridge first year medical syllabus, he wrote himself like a list of 100 and something questions, and each night before bed he would just kind of go through them, and his revision technique was pretty much just answering these questions, and he ended up coming second in the year out of like the
Yeah, so this is really just a variation of a flashcard thing. I think flashcards usually the implication there is a quick answer, but it doesn't have to be. So if you're asking yourself questions and then the questions are more elaborate or maybe takes a few paragraphs to answer, it's the same thing except you're giving prompts in a Word document to answer them rather than through flashcards verbally. So yeah, the one thing I would add on to this, if you have the time, is to actually handwrite your answers. I've talked about the powers of journaling, but if you can handwrite your answers rather than type them out, that will drill them into your memory much more than typing. One of the real benefits of journaling is the handwriting part of it, and it's because it's tactile and it's thoughtful and it takes time, more time than typing. So try that out.
whole cohort. He's very intelligent in itself, but talking to him afterwards, he put a lot of faith in this method of writing questions for yourself, because writing questions for yourself makes you engage in cognitive effort, and kind of the more brain power it takes to recall a fact, the better strengthened that connection seems to get, according to the evidence at least. So yeah, instead of kind of writing notes from the textbook or from the revision guide or from the lecture notes, maybe try this method where you're writing questions for yourself, and then when you're revising the topic using hopefully spaced repetition, which we'll talk about in the next video, when you're revising the topic, then you can just answer the questions in your head. And I find this to be a really, really effective strategy for getting lots of information into your head very quickly, and hopefully you can find it useful as well. So that brings us to the end of the video. I really hope you found some of this useful. Just to summarize, we've talked about why rereading, highlighting, underlining, and summarizing/making notes are probably not very efficient revision techniques. If you're using them, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. I'm just saying that, if you're using these techniques, which most of us do, and you think in yourself that your revision is not very effective or you're not really getting the results that you want, then maybe it's time to rethink some of these strategies. Feel free to continue using them, but what I would say is that use them, but alongside do practice testing, test yourself more, and then use spaced repetition and interleaved practice. Those are the three things we'll be talking about in future videos as well. So yeah, hopefully you found this video useful. We talked about why those three particular strategies are not very effective. We talked about some of the evidence behind active.
So there you go. Very good. I think he really went into detail here. He could have written a book about this, honestly. But I think that it was kind of like a book format where it just goes into excessive detail, explains why in very much detail with the science. But I think, long story short, you got to start using that active recall. Um, you got to stop doing the note taking, the rereading, the underlining, highlighting, because the science shows it doesn't help nearly as much as active recall. If you do use those techniques, use them in a way related to active recall, as in test yourself, ask yourself questions with flashcards or with actual prompts that you answer, and you just keep coming up with questions that are relevant that you think you'll be tested on, and then just keep testing yourself daily, every other day, every few days, and that active process of trying to pull those out of your memory will have a huge effect in the long run. Thanks for watching.